Well, it's like that old building that Tinkham used to own out of Westlake, the Hardiman Courts. They didn't have his name on it anywhere. It was like the CIA or something. Agent Hardiman. Good.
You should have asked. You only have
On the street? Yeah.
So he is retired. I had those
Not at night. Like in there for a second, I was sitting there. I was gotten back. Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. Sorry. Know the story, but the name hasn't. So this is his, let's make a big impression. What's
and also it's such a pleasure. I always
don't you actually think he was maybe well advised to right. Well, again, it's the same story as well. So why do you take the reject? I mean, if you could kind of do better, what would you think in more diverse and difficult environment is going to be better? Well, we got teaching people stuff.
Gentlemen, you should feel free to take your seats. Okay, correct.
And you saw them.
Yeah. No bill. Yeah. The woman that's representing the family is in Terry Gilman's office. So she was expressing shock.
Good evening, everyone. I think we're about to get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Brian Amcrott. I'm the Executive Director of the Laura and Alvin Siegel Lifelong Learning Program at Case Western Reserve University. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 2017 Northeast Ohio Public Policy Series. Tonight's program coming to you from the Tinkham Veale University Center on the campus of Case Western Reserve University. Our program tonight is titled The Election for Mayor, a discussion about the future of Cleveland. Before we begin, I want to recognize and thank a few organizations who were especially instrumental in making this year's public policy series possible, which includes a number of partners, of course, our own Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, but I also want to call out the League of Women Voters, Cleveland.com, the Solon Community Center, the Cuyahoga County Public Library, Cleveland Heights University Heights Public Library, and the Lakewood Public Library. We are also grateful to our corporate sponsor for the series, First Interstate Properties, for all of their support. Want to remind everyone that tomorrow evening there will be a candidate forum at the Cleveland Public Library. There's some flyers for that on the table outside. And our next public policy sessions will be September 19th, which is Ohio Drug Price Relief Act ballot issue, a look at both sides. That will be at the Cuyahoga County Public Library in Bay Village. And then September 27th, Race and Infant Mortality in Northeast Ohio, and that will be at the Heights Public Library main branch. During the question and answer portion of this evening's program, we ask that you write out your questions on note cards. If you don't have one, we can get you them. Just raise up your hand. And when you do have a question, again, just hold up your hand and they will be collected and brought to the panel. It is my pleasure tonight to introduce our moderator, Leila Atassi, and she will introduce the panelists. Reporter Leila Atassi has spent more than 14 years covering social justice issues, courts, the criminal justice system, and local government for Cleveland.com and The Plain Dealer. From 2012 until March 2017, she covered Cleveland City Hall with a focus on controversies involving the city-owned utilities and the airport, high-profile deadly police shootings, and the implementation of a federal consent decree governing police use of force. Currently, she is detailed to a special project called A Greater Cleveland, for which he is embedded with families living in Cleveland neighborhoods most affected by decisions made at City Hall. Please join me in welcoming Leila Atassi.
Great. Thank you. Thank you to the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland, to the Case Western Reserve University Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, to Cleveland.com, and to our corporate sponsor for this event, First Interstate Properties. And thank you so much for joining us on this beautiful late summer evening as we talk a little bit about Cleveland politics. I promise you that we will do our best to make this worth your time. So as Mayor Frank Jackson seeks an unprecedented fourth four-year term, he faces a crowd of challengers hailing from the business world, from city council, from other corners of the public and private sectors. All of them say that 12 years should have been plenty of time for Jackson to leave his mark on the city. So more than anything else, this election will be a referendum on Jackson's 12 years in office, as Cleveland voters decide, as you decide, if he deserves another term. Tonight, let's explore Jackson's strengths, vulnerabilities, and blind spots through the prism of some of the most important issues facing Cleveland. And we'll mine the collective institutional knowledge represented here on our panel to make some predictions about what Cleveland might look like after 4 more years of Jackson or with any of his challengers at the helm. So, joining us for this discussion this evening are Tom Beres, WKYC Channel 3 Senior Political Correspondent Emeritus, who retired last year after 37 years covering stories in Northeast Ohio. He has won 4 Emmys, 2 for investigative reporting, and is a member of the Cleveland Press Club Hall of Fame. Then next we have James Hardiman, with more than 4 decades of experience litigating civil rights and civil liberties issues, including school desegregation, police practices, and voting rights. Mr. Hardiman is one of the region's distinguished civil rights attorneys and the first vice president of the Cleveland branch of the NAACP. And then Chris Quinn, editor and president of Advance Ohio, my own mentor at Cleveland.com, who has been practicing journalism in this town as either reporter or editor and leader of our newsroom since the 90s. Coincidentally, Chris covered City Hall when Frank Jackson was serving on City Council, which will add another element of depth to this discussion tonight. So let's begin laying the groundwork by talking about what Frank Jackson was able to achieve during some very trying years of his tenure. To Jackson's credit, I think we should start off by saying that he managed to keep the city afloat during the recession foreclosure crisis, despite plummeting income tax collections, deep slashes to state local government funding, and other hardships. By most accounts, the city has made a laudable recovery. Today, business districts are booming. We had the RNC here. Public Square looks terrific. Opportunity Corridor is on its way. And last November, voters approved an income tax increase that pumps in an additional $80 million a year for enhanced city services. All of that serves as fundamental to Jackson's platform. But that said, Jackson's critics and challengers say his attention to downtown projects show that he has lost touch with the needs of residents in the city's most impoverished neighborhoods. And so, panelists, I'm going to kick it over to you. Are those valid criticisms? How do you think Jackson has done balancing the needs of his diverse constituency? And I guess how we'll roll is just whoever wants to start off, and let's just make it as conversational and casual as possible.
Well, obviously, any mayor of a big city has a mountain of huge issues on his plate, and none of them are solvable by simple formulas. You'd think I know that from broadcasting, wouldn't you? Obviously, he has picked and choose those issues that he attempted to focus a lot of energy resources on, which has resulted in the revived downtown and the new, much improved image around the country and the world of Cleveland, in large part due to the favorable publicity of the Republican convention, even if Cleveland will now be known as the city that launched Donald Trump. Yes, he has put a lot of emphasis on certain neighborhoods, particularly focusing resources on downtown. And now, not coincidentally, I think, he's turning his attentions to the neighborhoods with his neighborhood reinvestment plan, targeting a couple of really down and out neighborhoods that will get money from the city and from banks. Should he have done a better job with the limited resources? Arguably, you have three guys here who live in the suburbs who probably can't make that call as well as many of you can. But I think on balance, he's got a very distinguished record on this side of the ledger, and on the other side of the ledger, I think he's making efforts. I know his cliched statement is, well, you can judge the greatness of a city by how it treats the least of its residents here. So I think he's actually trying, as he says, to put the work in with these neighborhood improvement agreements for all projects, and trying to do more of the heavy lifting in the neighborhoods. But again, the question is, do the people who live in the neighborhoods feel so alienated from or distant from the projects that he's created downtown that they'd be willing to roll the dice on somebody with a lot less experience and a lot less of a record to go on?
As I think about it, this is 2017, and it was 50 years ago this year that we were all very, very proud when we elected the first African-American mayor of a major city in the United States of America. So the question is, in the past 50 years, how much progress have we made? You'll recall in '66 we had the Huff riots, in '68 we had the Glenville riots. So the question is, what role should and could a mayor play in the revitalization of the city? Is the city of Cleveland, even though its image has improved considerably over what it used to be, is the city of Cleveland now a place where people want to come? Is it a destination as opposed to a place to escape from? Do people who live, work, or play in the city of Cleveland, are they better off today than they were 12 years ago? Interestingly enough, as I was walking in, someone asked me if I could vote, who would I vote for? And I had to think long and hard about that, because the question is, all of the candidates have issues. There's no perfect candidate. They all have flaws. And you know the flaws of the top two challengers, and you probably know the flaws of the current incumbent. The question is, even though when people come to Cleveland, we're all excited to show them the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, we're all excited to show them the revitalization that's going on in Huff. But are we as excited to show them some of the places where lead paint is still peeling from houses, where children still cannot get a decent bite to eat, a place where our school system is still failing to graduate even 50% of the people who start out in the 9th grade? We've made progress, but unless we can address the educational issues, the housing issues, the issues related to police misconduct, excessive use of force, I think we're destined to continue marching backwards, because it was this administration, if you'll recall, in which police officers shot and killed Tamir Rice. It was this administration where Melissa Williams and Timothy Russell were shot and killed. It was this administration in which the Department of Justice came in and concluded that the city of Cleveland was responsible for a pattern or practice of use of excessive force. And we all know against whom that excessive force was directed. We all know that we now have a consent decree and we have a community police commission and we still have a monitoring commission. But the issue is whether or not people who feel that they've been misused or mistreated by the police department can find a way to have their problems addressed. That problem continues to exist, and I'll concede that downtown Cleveland looks really, really good, but I'll also admonish this administration about lead paint, about kids failing to graduate, about police misuse of their authority. So though we've come a long way, we've still got a long way to go.
The perspective that I think you mentioned at the beginning of your question about the budget is one that can't be overestimated. Frank Jackson has been running this city at a time when then the city has been losing the revenue it had. It's been increasingly difficult to keep things going. You remember a few years ago, Detroit went into default. So much of that budget is consumed by things like public safety that there's not a whole lot of discretionary money in there to work with. He'd been leading for years to the point where he was going to have to ask for that tax increase to get the money. Whether that is it's luck for him that he got it before this election year and could start spending the money on neighborhood projects, or it's a curse because everybody's calling that political. This is the first time there's been some money to spend in the neighborhoods. But I agree with Mr. Hardiman that for the people in neighborhoods right now, the biggest issue is the spray of bullets that are flying everywhere. There's an incredible public safety problem. And until the consent decree, this was a city with a police department that was largely out of control, as demonstrated by the incidents that Mr. Hardiman mentioned. Frank Jackson could have dealt with some of those without more taxes and didn't. And it was only when the federal government came in and insisted upon it that he did. Until children feel safe in their beds from gunshots, until they don't have drills at home where they have to get under the bed every time shots ring out, we're not going to have good quality of life in the neighborhoods. And that focus, even absent the money, was missing.
Because it seems the conversation is headed down this road, I'm just going to move toward that topic. But along one stop along the way would be the subject of police reform, which Mr. Hardiman brought up. You'd be hard pressed to find anyone in this country who doesn't know the name Tamir Rice. And we all know what happened the night that dozens of officers left their posts to take part in this high-speed chase and how that concluded. The U.S. Justice Department concluded that CPD had developed a culture of unconstitutional policing under the Jackson administration, and for the past couple years, the department has been operating under the tenets of a federal consent decree to rectify that. So my question to you is, to what extent does Jackson own that? And has Jackson's welcoming the police reform effort mitigated the policing problem as a liability for him in this election?
I'm not sure the administration welcomed the conclusions that the Department of Justice came up with. As a matter of fact, I think they were kicking and screaming when there was findings of unconstitutional policing in the city of Cleveland. Mm-hmm. Eventually they did agree on terms that were reduced to a consent decree, but it was by no means voluntary. The Department of Justice had a pretty good record of winning these kinds of pattern or practice lawsuits, and I think the city of Cleveland saw the inevitable and felt that it was better to resolve it by way of an agreement than it was to litigate it. But at the end of the day, I still remember Eric Holder and Mayor Frank Jackson having a press conference, and there were a lot of backslaps and handshaking, and everyone was agreeing that this was a new day. Mm-hmm. Well, unfortunately, a lot of the people have not seen that new day as of yet. We know just last year, a young man on 102nd and St. Clair, in what has been commonly referred to as a high crime area, was trying to go into his house, and the police thought he was a burglar, and instead of finding out if he was or was not trying to break into his house, they arrested him. He filed a complaint with the Citizens Review Board and is still waiting to get a response to that. So yes, we've made some progress, and yes, that consent decree has a lot of good things in it if followed. But the reality is that at the end of the day, it's just a piece of paper. And unless or until the CPPA and the police union get on board, civil rights attorneys will still look at Cleveland as a payday, because many of these lawsuits that were filed against the city of Cleveland are coming to fruition, and the city is paying, and paying dearly. Now, should people have to live under that threat? Should they have to live under a police department that is not really concerned about their best interests? I doubt very seriously if anyone would say that's the case, but that's the reality if you live in the city of Cleveland, unfortunately. And as I've said many times, we've come a long way, but we've still got a hell of a long way to go.
I mean, given that this whole effort is a very lengthy work in progress, yes, some progress has been made, but a whole lot more needs to be accomplished. I know we've seen a number of partial progress reports by the monitors who have ultimate oversight for making sure that Cleveland complies with and lives up to and adheres to the terms of the consent decree. And a lot of those spot checks along the way have said, well, you know, you're way behind schedule in terms of dealing with citizen complaints and officer accountability, and you know, having new and better equipment for the police. So I don't know so much that you could say that the mayor's dragging his feet, but the city is not living up to, or at least not meeting the benchmarks that it agreed to meet.
Well, part of the problem, I think, is Frank Jackson. One, he doesn't like being told what to do when he saw the consent decree as a process for his being ordered to do something. Two, he stands by people in his administration who he probably shouldn't stand by. And so the leadership in the public safety department has been the same for a long time. He ultimately did appoint Calvin Williams as police chief, and I think anybody who saw Chief Williams during the RNC was impressed. This is a guy who does seem to understand the city a good bit. So there is movement there. One of the biggest problems that the Justice Department found is the police department is seen as almost an occupying force in Cleveland because the officers aren't from Cleveland. That's a long-term process to fix. This summer, there's a police foundation that's now tied to the police department, brought 65 kids from Cleveland neighborhoods in for a 5 or 6 week camp at Tri-C, and they're hoping that they start building a pipeline of Cleveland people, Cleveland residents, to become police officers. If they get to that point, if that's successful, that whole feeling of the occupying force should subside, but that doesn't happen overnight.
One of the things the mayor complains about quite a bit, and I think legitimately as something that's beyond his control, is the difficult terms that he has to operate under with the police contract, where repeatedly they attempt to discipline officers, in many cases fire or suspend them, and the vast majority of cases wind up getting reversed and people getting reinstated to their jobs and getting back pay because of the process that goes on through arbitration. I mean, maybe we're fast forwarding here to things that a new mayor would have to deal with or worry about. But I think you know, whenever the police contract does come up for review, I think the mayor would want to make an effort to have the terms of that contract modified somewhat, so the city doesn't go through this repeat riding the merry-go-round process of firing, rehiring, firing, rehiring. Again, it's obvious that the system seems to work largely in favor of the union.
What's a little bit distressing about this campaign is, with public safety being the #1 issue and all of the candidates talking about it, you're not hearing much in the way of concrete plans for dealing with what's going on in the neighborhoods. You hear some things about police accountability. Eric Brewer has put together a plan where he says he would be much stricter with police misbehavior. But other than saying you'd hire more police officers, which is hugely expensive, and nobody's saying where the money comes from, you're not seeing many ideas for how this violence problem is going to be dealt with. And that should be, if it's the number one issue, that should be the idea where that they're competing on.
I'm not sure I would agree that it's the number one issue. It's one of the main issues. Education, arguably, is also a major issue that we should be trying to address. Police misconduct is extremely important because the perception of many residents of the city of Cleveland is that the police force is an occupying force. And anyone that has lived in the Cleveland, works in the city of Cleveland, or plays in the city of Cleveland is aware of that, particularly if they are people of color. Now, if you live in the burbs and you come into Cleveland for your 9-to-5 gig and then you go home, maybe you don't see what's going on in the city. But yes, there is a significant amount of black-on-black crime. I'm the first one to acknowledge that. And there's no excuse for that. But by the same token, that can't be used to justify police misconduct. We all are aware of what happened in Euclid. Euclid's not Cleveland, and the mayor of Cleveland has nothing to do with what goes on in Euclid. But the reality is that police and police unions have an inordinately large amount of influence. And unless we start taking a look at the police union contract, we're going to have these same problems 50 years from now when we have another anniversary and we celebrate the 100th year of Carl Stokes being elected mayor of the city of Cleveland. So yes, we've got police problems, we've got education problems, we've got a dilapidated infrastructure problem, lead paint continues to be a problem. All of these are things and issues that whomever is elected mayor of the city of Cleveland is going to have to address. And at the end of the day, we fight hard to avoid a collapse like what happened in Detroit, but would a collapse be all that bad if we could get some of these problems fixed? That's a rhetorical question.
Before we move on from the issue of...
We say at least we're not Detroit. You want to take that away from us?
Before we move on to the next topic, I wanted to throw this question out there. I think, Chris, you mentioned that Calvin Williams was installed as police chief, and he seems to be well-liked in that position, both by those in the ranks and citizens. However, the former police chief, Mike McGrath, is the safety director, and Marty Flask, the former safety director, is still in the orbit in City Hall and very influential. If given 4 more years, first, I think that it's one of the criticisms that many people have of Frank Jackson is that he tends to be loyal to a fault. I've heard it so many times, that he keeps those on board who might not necessarily deserve their position or aren't necessarily the best fit for those jobs. So if he is given 4 more years, will Frank Jackson help CPD become a better department, or will that goal be hindered if he doesn't replace his top police brass, talking about Mike McGrath specifically, who oversaw the department when it was at its worst?
Well, I mean, obviously, the mayor has been pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed, with a lot of people saying McGrath must go, Flask must go. But again, the more, given his personality, the more you push him, the less likely he is to take that step or reach that conclusion. I mean, I think both of those gentlemen are well past the eligible age for retirement, and I'm sure there's some...
I think they've retired a couple times.
Yes, I know, right. Double dipping and those sorts of things involved. But I mean, the mayor, as you say, is painfully loyal to people who have been loyal to him. I mean, another case in point of, there was that very large scandal involving firefighters overtime and all the issues surrounding that. And the chief who was on duty during when all that happened was sort of allowed to quietly retire and tiptoe off the stage without any real meaningful consequences. So do I think the mayor would be likely on his own to discharge Mr. McGuire, Mr. Flask? If he hasn't done it now, I don't think he's going to. I think it will be their call to serve
to serve as long as they want.
There are already whispers that Calvin Williams would be a candidate for mayor in 4 years, and if Jackson is interested in grooming a potential successor, you could see him bringing Calvin Williams in as public safety director, possibly. It is astounding that he has stood by McGrath. McGrath, 2 years before the consent decree, we did a series on police use of force, and he absolutely refused to acknowledge there was an issue, even though every use of the taser was ruled as justified, which is just ridiculous in any measurement. But as Tom says, once you push him on something like that, he locks in and he will not change his mind.
It's kind of interesting that, Tom, you brought up the situation involving the firemen that were trading shifts. I believe there were 13 firemen that were involved in this process. 12 were Caucasian, 1 was African American.
And?
Guess which one got fired? The African American. The other 12 all kept their job, and right now there's litigation going on as to whether or not there was any legitimate business reason to fire the one black person who was involved in trading of shifts, while all the other 12 white firemen retained their position.
Wasn't he the firefighter who basically showed up, once every 4 months and was working
in
in
California?
Right?
Actually, he was substitute teaching in Cleveland. Okay. So yes, but he was similarly situated. He did the same thing the others did. He traded shifts, and he traded more shifts, but he did trade shifts. Now, arguably, a federal judge will have to make that decision, but the reality is they all did the same thing. 12 were white, 1 was black. The 1 black man got fired. The 12 white kept their jobs.
Just another quick observation here from an old TV guy. The city would have had much more damage to its reputation if it had been working with 20th century technology and it had dash cams on its cars during the crosstown Timothy Russell, Melissa Williams chase. I mean, could you imagine the national publicity and how many times we would have seen that story on national news over and over and over again if there were video of the hail of bullets and the crossfire and what actually transpired? I mean,
I'd argue that.
I was surprised that that incident didn't generate more national attention and publicity and outrage.
If they had the cameras, though, I'd argue the incident wouldn't have happened, because then there would have been accountability and they would have known it. I think they probably would have been guided by the knowledge that everything was
Possibly.
on the cameras.
Okay.
So I guess we'll move on then to the next topic, which has come up a couple times so far already, violence on the streets. After the city's income tax increase passed, Jackson pledged to build a comprehensive anti-violence initiative that draws together intervention, street outreach, social programming, workforce development, and community policing. To oversee it all, he named longtime federal and county prosecutor Dwayne Deskin as the city's new chief of prevention, intervention, and opportunity for youth. In June, the city announced that they had hired new personnel. They had begun expanding the presence of violence interventionists in hospital emergency rooms and on the streets. They offered 500 summer jobs to teens, and they expanded hours and programming at the recreation centers. A lot of critics say too little, too late. We're at the end of his 3rd term, and now he's just beginning to roll out these initiatives. So, panelists, what do you think? Does this appear to be a lot of lip service to a very, very important problem, or are these initiatives a good start on a path toward something greater in Jackson's 4th term?
You're never going to be able to arrest your way out of this kind of an issue. And for people who suggest we need more police officers, we need Dwayne Deskin in a position where he can put in place some strategies to eliminate street violence. This is the Band-Aid approach. And I would argue that we need to develop some type of program for children so that they can get summer jobs. We need to provide training for some of these kids. A kid that has lots of time and nothing to do with it and no money is going to get into trouble. That's the reality of the situation.
Well, wasn't a big part of this program, Bill, is also not just being about enforcement. I know that special unit, NICE, what does that stand for again? I'm very bad with acronyms,
Yeah,
but
I know what you're talking about.
but I think wasn't a big part of the program supposedly what you're talking about to create more job prospects, to create more training prospects, to to work with children and steer them out of trouble before they get too far down the path. I mean, was there a large social service component to this program, I think?
Yes, there were a lot of social service components, but the reality is very little has been on the social service side, and most of it has been on the arrest and prosecution side. Dwayne, who I know and like as a person, is a former prosecutor. That's what he knows. He knows how to arrest people, how to charge them, and if necessary, put them in jail. I've heard him say that if you don't give somebody up, you get no deals. And basically that suggests that let's get tough on crimes and criminals. Well, we've tried that. Just say no, those type of strategies. Get tough on crime. Those strategies don't work. And I think that we've got to focus a lot more on the social service side. Even though there's something in there about social service, we haven't gone far enough for long enough.
But Jackson also points out that the violence is a symptom, that the problem is really the poverty that racks the city, and his attempts to deal with that have been through the transformation plan to improve education, which is very slowly moving up, and his community benefits program to make sure people in the city get to participate in the huge projects that are going on. That's a slow build. You can't do that overnight, but if you can help people get out of poverty, get out of the hopelessness, that can cut into violence.
Well, and I can't disagree with that, but it was 1954 when the Supreme Court said that separate was unequal. It was 1973 that the NAACP filed its lawsuit against the Cleveland Public Schools, alleging that they were operating a dual system, one for whites and one for blacks. So, and I think it was the 1980s when the judge gave mayoral control of the schools to the city executive officer, which was the mayor. So I don't know that we can say it's a long process and use that as an excuse. It's been more than 60 years that we've been trying to get a handle on education with a lot of very good, knowledgeable educators. So if the mayor of the city of Cleveland is the only person in the city that has control of the schools, I would imagine we would be doing a lot better than all the other school districts around the state that don't have mayoral control. There was a reason for it. Now, have we seen the results? Mayoral control was given to the mayor in Mike White's administrations. That was how many administrations ago? 3. And we still are trying to get a handle on better performance, fewer dropout rates, teenage pregnancies. These are issues that, in my opinion, along with excessive use by the police, are things that must be addressed and must be given a priority. And if we simply focus on arresting juveniles and not giving them a second chance, then I think we're missing the mark by a substantial way.
But put Mike White and Jane Campbell aside, because we're talking about the legacy of Frank Jackson. 5 years ago, he persuaded a Republican legislature, Republican governor, to help rewrite some laws to build this transformation plan, working with Eric Gordon, the superintendent, who's a real educator. And knowing that this would be a slow build, but they have seen the graduation rate increase a few ticks. They have seen the dropout rate drop a few ticks, enough that residents at the 4-year interval went and reauthorized the tax to pay for it. So if you're looking at these last 50, 60 years, the first time you've seen the number of people attending Cleveland schools go up has only been in the last few years. It had been a steady decline. So maybe we're seeing the beginning of that rise.
But the question is the progress far enough, and is it fast enough? I mean, well, you're right. But I mean, when the school system still gets it across the board, FFFFFFF report card, it's pretty hard to put a good face on that.
Yeah, that actually was the next topic I was going to introduce. But yeah, have the improvements been too incremental for? I mean, just this past week at the City Club, that was one of the key talking points that Mayor Jackson brought to the table, was that the school transformation plan has been a success. And so
I don't think he said a success. I think he was saying it had moved a few ticks.
Incremental improvement.
Yeah.
I went to a 50-year reunion last weekend for the Glenville Class of 1967. And one of the issues was, of those people that graduated from Glenville High School in 1967, which was 50 years ago, how many of them would send their children to a Cleveland school? Even though they were very proud of what they did 50 years ago and how far they had come, and they talked about Metzenbaum and a number of other people that went to Glenville back in the 30s, and Mike White, who became mayor of the city of Cleveland, a Glenville graduate, and everyone was very happy and very proud, but they weren't sending their children to Cleveland schools. And one of the unfulfilled promises of the school desegregation was to make the Cleveland schools a magnet, so that people who lived in the burbs would want to send their children to Cleveland schools. We had that school down on Lakefront, Aviation High School. What kid would not want to become a pilot and, you know, fly off into the wild blue yonder? Now it's boarded up and used as a storage facility and scheduled to be torn down. So yes, we've made in the last few years some incremental improvements, but by the same token, the charter school movement is taking off. And a lot of people who otherwise would be sending their children to Cleveland public schools are now sending their children to charter schools. Whether that's good, bad, or somewhere in between, the perception is that the schools are not the places that they want their kids to go, with the possible exception of John Hay High School. With that exception, or if you want to play football, Glenville. But other than those two, the incremental improvements, I don't think are enough to satisfy the average citizen.
I mean, we've seen a big influx of young people moving into the city and moving downtown. I mean, the big question in the next chapter is going to be, well, what happens when those young people start young families and have children that are of age, and they have to decide, where am I going to send my child to school? Will we see a big stampede out of the city because the schools haven't made the leaps and bounds improvements that they need to?
I also was wondering, has anyone heard anything impressive from any of the challengers on where they would take the schools next? Has that even been introduced into any of the forums? Or I've heard things about, you know, more vocational training, for instance.
Job training. A couple of the candidates talk a lot about building job training centers, that their focus would be preparing Cleveland's youth for jobs. But other than saying job training centers, it's pretty vague. Brandon Krastowski has a record of providing jobs and training, and he said he would expand that.
And even though he's another guy named Eric Brewer said he would fire Eric Gordon if he became mayor because the plan wasn't proceeding well enough.
So I want to move now on to the topic of building and housing. And this is a multi-pronged issue, really. On one hand, we have the decay of the city's housing stock, and Jackson has at times embraced demolition when the money is available, yet he's resisted enforcing housing code on those who can't afford it, especially the elderly. On the other hand, we've got the lead paint problem. Thousands of children were exposed to toxic levels of lead paint in their homes, while city health officials failed to investigate, and a backlog of unresolved cases started to grow. With the income tax increase, Jackson hired a team of inspectors to focus on identifying hazards at rental properties. They're working on a 5-year timeline, but it's unclear how the city would handle hazards when they are identified through this process. So, to the panel, what do you make of Jackson's approach to building and housing these past 12 years? What will Cleveland's housing stock look like in 4 years if he's reelected?
If you drive down Chester, you can see some very grandiose houses. However, if you go either north or south between 105th and maybe 55th, or maybe downtown to 30th, houses are falling apart, lead paint is flaking, that's where the people that have children are actually living. And we know that Judge Ray Pianca, who died just last year, had some programs that he thought would give homeowners some incentive to try and straighten out the problems they were having with the housing stock. But I think that was a step, but it was a little baby step. And I think that this lead paint crisis was magnified not by the administration, but by a series of articles that appeared in the Plain Dealer that exposed what was going on in the city of Cleveland. This lead paint crisis is not new. We've had lead paints on houses that is toxic to children and in fact creates an environment in which children cannot learn, cannot eat, cannot grow and realize their potential. This has been going on for at least the last 75 years. But when the Plain Dealer started to expose it, then some movement was made. And yes, there were some additional housing inspectors and there was some prosecution of some of the people who were involved with maintaining houses that were not up to code. Will this continue? I would hope this would be probably the third or fourth priority. The Legal Aid Society has pending at the current time a lawsuit against the city of Cleveland because of the lead paint fiasco. So are we headed in the right direction? Will the new administration or the old administration, if they get re-elected, will they address this issue? And I recognize and appreciate the fact that money is a problem. To hire housing inspectors is difficult if you don't have the money to hire them with. So while we recognize the problem, somehow we've got to put more into the infrastructure of the city as opposed to putting more into the prosecution of people that have gone astray.
I know the city has gotten and spent a lot of money that it got from federal sources and state sources and court settlements that Mike DeWine passed out. I mean, if I had $1 for every press conference with the mayor in front of a house and a bulldozer taking one good whack at the house that I covered, I could probably buy myself a nice dinner anyway. So I think they've been trying to use the resources they have, but the problem is so immense and so huge, and it's just, not capable of being addressed by the limited city budget.
But there's no way of looking at the lead issue as anything but a failure of the administration. They dropped the ball on this. They didn't. You
heard the stories about money they lost because they weren't.
And they didn't follow up, and they didn't send the reports to the state they needed to send. The way they're dealing with it now, Frank Jackson's got a philosophy that the city has too little affordable housing. And if you just go through and demolish all of the houses with lead paint, you won't have enough housing for people of lesser means. So he's hoping that some abatement can be used. In the meantime, though, children are exposed to lead, and that just should not be acceptable.
Mm-hmm. So moving on to public utilities. For most of Jackson's first 2 terms in office, customer service at the Cleveland Water Department was a disaster. Thousands of pending bills backlogged the system, and call wait times were abysmal. Jackson eventually hired a turnaround firm that not only righted the ship for the utility, but it created enough operational efficiencies to give ratepayers a 3-year break from rate hikes. Meanwhile, however, there's always however, problems seem perennial at Cleveland Public Power, where Jackson let leadership there make horrible decisions, ill-advised purchase power agreements that proved extremely costly, investments in coal power plants, and an expensive failed proposal to build a trash-burning facility in the city. Also, the city currently is fighting a class action lawsuit claiming that CPP charged its customers hidden fees for decades. All of this at CPP with no regime change whatsoever there. So to the panel, what do you think? Are utilities a net win for Jackson in this election, or does this department represent Jackson's undue devotion to longtime city officials who have been loyal to him through the years?
The water department is the much bigger issue because it serves the entire region. And this is another case of Jackson not liking being told what to do. As media, all the media in town were reporting the customer service problems, he just got his back up, and it took him probably 2 years to fix it, but he did fix it. But put that aside, Cleveland has one of the best water departments in the country. While Toledo had no redundancy in its system, when the algae came in and they had to shut it off, Cleveland has the ability to work with that. There was a huge investment during Mike White's years in the infrastructure of the water department. There continues to be investment. Frank Jackson has used the water department and his ability to maintain the lines in the suburbs to work cooperative agreements with other governments to be cooperative in business poaching. I mean, all in all, the water department today is a very, very strong agency and probably can be looked at as a win.
I think in a lot of ways, I mean, I think he's, I don't want to say fixed all, but by and large neutralized it as an issue, I think.
Yeah. And CPP is a smaller issue. We're just discovering some of the issues there. I don't know that that's resonating with the public like the water department did, so we'll have to see.
I kind of want to use this, though, to talk about the issue of loyalty. How much do you think, how to phrase this, how much do you think Frank Jackson's appointments over the last 12 years might have held back his administration? If you think so. I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but.
I don't think the water department's an example of that. Oh, I don't think the water department's an example of that. That's largely had pretty good leadership through the years. The customer service issue was something different.
Well, more generally.
But
then.
in other departments, I think that there have been a number of cases, we've talked about it in public safety, where he stands with people far too long.
Nothing from. Okay. And I kind of wanted to, let's see where we are on time, conclude with the airport, really. You know, Cleveland Hopkins Airport in recent years has weathered problems from maintaining its air carriers to plowing snow on its runways. In 2014, the administration seemed blindsided by United Airlines' announcement that it would drop its hub at Hopkins. United's lease agreement requires the airline to continue paying on the outstanding debt on Concourse D until 2027, but the lease also gives the airline exclusive use of that 16-gate facility, which pretty much leaves that concourse as a ghost town at an airport that's really struggling to attract new carriers. Then, in 2015, the FAA investigated a complaint filed by an airfield maintenance worker and slapped Hopkins with a pretty costly civil penalty for violating an agreement to adequately staff snow removal teams and de-ice runways. Jackson recently hired a City Hall outsider. This is one department that has benefited from his, looking outward. And the new director of port control is a longtime airport operations consultant. We're yet to see what he's going to do. But has Jackson done enough to dodge the airport as a liability in this election season? If he's reelected, will the airport continue to be a source of dysfunction for the city from time to time?
There was a point 5 or 6, maybe 7 years ago where the airport was just a hole, and the bathrooms, people wouldn't use them, and they've invested a lot of money in making it better. The snow removal issue, which Leila was the one that uncovered, was a scary issue, because if the snow isn't cleared, you don't want to land there. You don't want to be taking off there because you can be in serious trouble. The FAA hit them with a huge fine for this, and it kind of remains to be seen how that's rectified. Every winter kind of raises the question, will Hopkins be safe? And I don't think we know.
I don't think we ever got, did we ever get a definitive answer? Remember, the former airport director said, well, he didn't give me enough money to, but your budget is independent. So I didn't have enough money to hire these people. So I was always a little bit fuzzy on whether the accountability was with the mayor or the people running the airport.
That's a great question. I just want to throw out there that I put in a public records request.
Still waiting for it, huh?
I waited so long that the whole world eventually lost interest, and the whole FAA thing was resolved by the time we received the records.
This is a whole other topic.
Fund public records, City Hall.
Their approach to public records and transparency.
That's
But
right.
they did. The sad thing here was the FAA came in and they made an agreement with the city on how they would solve this problem. And when the FAA came back later and saw these complaints, the city had not lived up to it. That was the reason for the fine. That they had worked out a deal, and then the city dropped the ball on that deal, possibly endangering people. So.
It was never clear to me ultimately whether it was Director Smith's fault or the mayor's fault, or
Well, ultimately, it's
Yeah.
the mayor's fault, right? You
Right.
know,
Yeah.
It's his watch, his team, right?
All right.
It's kind of interesting that this is becoming a referendum on Frank Jackson's 12 years. And I guess other than what the other candidates have actually said or shared in public, we can't criticize them like we are criticizing Frank Jackson because
course.
they have never ran a major city with all the problems that are associated with running a city of this size.
Although we can talk about the two councilmen because their big complaint is that Frank Jackson didn't do enough for their neighborhoods. And his retort to them is, you're the councilman, that was your job. You know, when I was a councilman, I took care of my neighborhood. And that's an interesting debate on who's to blame for that
So
failure.
I think Councilman Reed's main issue is a lack of urgency in regard to the increasing homicide rate and the violence. And here we are, we're on a track for another year of 100 plus and 100 really plus homicides, which would be the third or fourth in a row. And I know he's fond of saying that during Frank Jackson's time in office, more people were killed in Greater Cleveland than the entire population of Brattonall, which is 1,220 something. But I mean, Mr. Reed, I don't want to say he's Johnny One Note in terms of what's important to him on a campaign here, but he does raise a legitimate question. I mean, are enough dramatic things being done to try and reduce so many of these senseless homicides?
On the other hand, you know, Frank Jackson, his response to that is, well, what do you suggest, you know, Zach Reed? I can't tell you how many events I've been to that Zach Reed has organized where he brings everyone to the table to have a huge discussion about violence,
Right.
but then his follow-up has been pretty weak, don't you think? I mean, it's...
Well, he says he would hire 400 additional police officers,
Right.
but the money for that, you'd have to cut somewhere to be able to pay them.
Right. Well, and also I feel like in the past he hasn't necessarily demonstrated the grasp on how much that might cost the city in general. And so there, you know, I understand where Frank Jackson comes from in that regard.
But Mr. Hardiman's right. This election, I think you started this out. This is really a referendum on Frank Jackson, less than it is a battle of who's the best candidate.
Right.
So what is the question? Is he is he in danger of being Bernie Kosar and having a last term with diminished skill set? Is he run out of new ideas and the last 4 years would just be overseeing and babysitting the initiatives he's launched already?
That's what he says. I mean, he wants to see through the consent decree, the
Right.
transformation plan, the community benefits. I mean, the difference in the next 4 years is the city, because of the tax increase, has some money. So you might see changes in neighborhoods that had not been there for the previous 12.
Right. Well, I mean, if you vote for another candidate beside Frank Jackson, obviously it's a gamble, it's a risk. He, I think, ultimately concluded that none of the other candidates running were capable or worthy of continuing the important efforts he has underway.
I think I've heard that, but I've got some concern. Is that ego?
Yeah.
Or does he really have any legitimate and defensible reasons as to why the other candidates cannot run a major city? Before he was elected mayor, what was he doing?
Right.
He was a councilman.
You know, I think after the City Club debate, it occurred to me as I was walking out that if you combine the business acumen of some of those candidates with the institutional knowledge of other candidates and, you know, the track record of others, you could have the perfect candidate. So I guess we'll wrap up this portion of the discussion by, you know, just asking of the rest of the field, what has impressed you? Is there someone's platform that you think could actually, no matter who is the mayor next, they could play a role in the administration and at least set the course for the city in the right direction in one small way?
Mr. Krastowski with his very successful program, training former inmates and giving them jobs in the restaurant industry. He claims that he wants to build 5 job training centers around the city. I mean, that would seem to have some merit. I mean, that's the one thing that stands out to me. But what's a couple of the exceptional things here actually have two Republicans running. I mean, I thought they were like unicorns. You know, you actually have two Republicans running in a mayor's race in Cleveland. That's pretty extraordinary. And I think that maybe offers some hope for the future of, you know, younger Cleveland residents from the business community maybe wanting to contribute in some fashion.
Mm-hmm.
I too am somewhat impressed by the idea that we can create jobs for people. That seems to me to be about the most solid thing that I've heard from any of the candidates, and that has been missing for the last 12 years. We've talked about police issues, we've talked about education, but unless we can figure out a way to find a place for the unemployed to become employed, I think we're destined to continue to have problems.
Mm-hmm. Nothing, Chris?
Well, you know, if you walked onto planet Earth last week and saw that debate and knew nothing else, I think you would have walked out saying that Eric Brewer had the most concrete ideas and the clearest command of the issues. But of course, if you then go to Eric Brewer's Facebook page, where he rants and raves and lacks any sense of civility, and you know the history, then that falls apart. But if you're looking for a concrete agenda, I mean, he has a very clear public health agenda, very clear public safety agenda, and that's surprised me.
All right. Well, let's do some audience questions here. This is a good one. Should there be term limits for the Cleveland mayor?
Well, you look at all of the extraordinary mayors that Cleveland has had, Tom Johnson and, you know, Newton D. Baker and George Voinovich and Mike White, and nobody even attempted to do what Mayor Jackson is doing, try for a fourth term. So, you know, is Mayor Jackson putting himself in a category above and beyond and in some sort of a super mayor classification here by striving for this, you know, this extra 4 years that nobody's even attempted to achieve before? I guess since nobody thought that anybody would ever run for a fourth term, nobody thought it would be necessary to.
If
The mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. All right. Well, I'll try to condense it here. Basically, you know, Frank Jackson is doing something that none of Cleveland's historically great mayors have even contemplated doing before, and so it's. You know, nobody ever thought that there would be a need, I think, to, you know, cap the term limits, that you know, the political natural order of things would just have constant turnover. So, you know, I guess it's a debatable issue. I don't know how many other big cities have term limits on their chief executives.
If Jackson had not run, I think you would have seen other very
candidates.
highly qualified candidates run. And so, you know, 12 years is a long time. I mean, you can leave a lot of mark on a city after 12 years. Mike White did, Frank Jackson has. But his presence, I think, kept out some candidates that voters would have been very interested in seeing.
I have very mixed emotions about term limits and age limits, because we all know that judges cannot run for office after they turn 70. So is that a violation of the anti-discrimination law against old judges? Maybe we should have some prohibition against old politicians. But I have some serious concerns about that kind of thing. And if people get the kind of government that they have chosen, then that's what they're entitled to. Take a look at the presidency.
Here's another question. If you had to name the most influential person in leading Cleveland forward, is it the mayor of Cleveland? If not, who is it, or who could it be? Who else is a top mover and shaker?
You know, I think a lot of people thought when the county changed its form of government that the county executive would ultimately rise to be the more powerful position. The county has all the social service taxes and provides a lot of the services that are important. But so far, it seems like the mayor remains the #1 mover and shaker. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I would tend to agree. It's the mayor.
Although, I guess by nature of the agreement here with the dead in the water Q deal here, but it was the county executive who I think did all the negotiating on it because the county was primary party. But I think a number of people maybe thought that Mayor Jackson should have been more aggressive or more active or more involved. My sense was that he just ratified what they presented him.
Yeah, I think part of the problem with the Q deal was in a mayoral election year and became very, very political. And Jackson may have decided to not get heavily involved for that reason. Right.
So to that point about the Q deal, another audience question is about the impact of the announcement that the Cavs would be pulling out of the funding arrangement with the city to update the Q. What is the overall impact to the city, do you think? Do you think that they'll come back at it another way?
Jobs, money, opportunities. But this was our democracy at work. A number of people wanted more from the Cavaliers than was being presented, and they went about it the right way. And the Ohio Supreme Court said that it was a ballot issue, and Dan Gilbert decided to take his ball and bat or his Nikes and basketball and go home. What will this mean moving forward? A lot of people will not make a lot of money. The All-Star game will not be played in Cleveland next year or year after. Cleveland may pack up and leave and follow LeBron out to Los Angeles. Who knows? But I think at the end of the day, it's a lot of money that will be lost.
I think maybe this diffuses this as being as important an issue as it might have been in the mayor's race. I mean, I know it's very unlikely that it would have wound up on the same ballot as the mayor's race, but I think the whole idea of people being thwarted in their attempt to exercise their charter rights under the city's governance, and the mayor obviously had a hand in this, as did Council President Kelly. I think whether somehow that was maybe an unintended consequence or maybe a secondary intention of pulling it at this time. I mean, I think it maybe does benefit Mayor Jackson some in the mayor's race.
I suspect that the long-term effect of this is that the city council and the mayor will be more likely to play by the rules when people bring in petitions. Twice in the past year, we've had people play by the rules, follow the law, seek to put something on the ballot, and twice you've seen the city now illegally, both times, thwart that effort and get bitten by it. I think the next time somebody brings in petitions following the rules, the city will follow the rules also.
Well, it's so hard to follow. I mean, the city wound up suing itself in a sense here, and it's like we're suing us, so we'll make sure that we'll do the right thing. It's just kind of very, to an old guy sitting on the sidelines, just very hard to follow.
So this question is directed to Mr. Hardiman, but obviously you guys might have something to add too. Our state system of funding education was deemed unconstitutional decades ago. What can the mayor do, and what can we do to assist the mayor to bring attention to and resolution to this situation?
I have never understood that Roth decision, because you're absolutely right. Our system of funding our schools based on property taxes was declared unconstitutional. It's been up and down several times, and finally I think the decision was made, this is too complicated, we'll leave well enough alone. I think the solution for our schools is not with the executive branch, but with the legislative branch. We've got to figure out a way to fund our schools that's fair. Why should a kid in Beechwood get a laptop when they get into the 7th grade, and a kid in Cleveland is using books that were written 30 years ago? We spend, I think, statewide about $12,000 per child. I'm not sure what we spend on children in Cleveland, but it's not $12,000, I can assure you of that. Our system is broken, and our legislators have got to take this seriously. as opposed to sticking their head in the sand. And that's one of the reasons that people move to certain communities, because of the school system, particularly if they have kids or expecting to have children. So yes, our system of funding schools is unconstitutional. It's been unconstitutional for many, many, many years, and we choose not to do a thing about it.
All right. Will Cleveland even get released from its police consent decree?
Yes, eventually. I think it's set to expire in 2019. But the reality is it can be extended if the judge concludes that they have not made the progress that he thinks they should make. This will not become another school case under Frank Battisti that went on for 25 some odd years. Cleveland does not want to be under a consent decree. Eventually, the court will conclude that they have accomplished what they were ordered to do, or they've gone so far and we can't do anything more with what we've got to work with. But eventually, they will be off from under that consent decree.
Do you think Attorney General Sessions' public statements that we're not so much interested in these consent decrees anymore will maybe somehow weaken at least the federal government's commitment to see this through?
I think it already has.
Yeah.
Whether or not it will affect Judge Solomon Oliver is a different issue, because he's not bound by what Sessions said, even though they both are from Alabama, for whatever that's worth. Nor is he bound by what the president says. But oftentimes the president has a lot of power. Didn't he just pardon somebody for doing something illegal? That's another story, though.
That question presumes that the city might not want to follow it, but I actually believe Frank Jackson wants the consent decree to be effective. I mean, he still lives in a neighborhood where people talk about what police are doing. Going back many mayors, there have been efforts made to bring this police department under control. This consent decree is really the only method that has a chance of succeeding, and I believe that the city does want to enforce it. So you got a judge that wants to do it, you got the city that wants to do it, and a prosecutor's office that's not trying to pull out of it. There's no reason to think it won't move forward.
Mm-hmm. Next question. Will Cleveland ever agree to more significant steps towards regionalism?
Well, through the water department, they've done some of that. But Frank Jackson, look at East Cleveland. I mean, his whole attitude there is, I'm not doing that unless they ask me to. I'm not going to use the muscle of Cleveland to take that over. It would be interesting if you had a mayor that started looking at some of the inner ring suburbs that are challenged, the Cleveland Heights and some of and Euclid, and if we merged, we're bigger. We have more muscle, we could do more things together, but that's not Jackson's way. And I don't think any of the other candidates have talked about it.
Just think what we could have if we had a regional school system. We would have probably one of the best school systems in the country if we regionalize. But is Fairview Park going to want to partner with Cleveland? Are they going to want to send their little babies over to Glenville? I don't think so. So everybody has created their own separate fiefdom, and to incorporate the various burbs, even the inner ring burbs, into the city of Cleveland would create a lot of resistance. Take a look at what happened in East Cleveland. They didn't want to come to Cleveland, and they talked about all the heritage and all the history that went with East Cleveland, even though they couldn't pay their bills. But they were very reluctant to even start to engage in the conversation.
Well, even out in the suburbs, you have all of these redundancies where everybody's got a finance department, everybody's got a public service department.
Of course.
But okay, so Ed Fitzgerald, I think, when he was in office, did a little bit of a dainty push trying to work with a number of suburbs in Orange and Bruce Acres, Pepper Pike, a number of those smaller postage stamp Wade Hills communities out there. And after a couple of years of trying to roll the stone up the hill, even that just collapsed and didn't happen. So it might be a lot more logical for that for initiative for that to come from the county. But again, I think there's this would, to be successful. This would have to be from originating in the communities and not imposed on the communities. And I just don't see cities willing to give up their flexibility and independence.
How did Columbus do it? Did they do the same
Water
thing?
diplomacy.
Right.
They had the system that said, you want water, you'll join Columbus.
And apparently we don't have that muscle.
Well, I think the ship has sailed.
Well, Chris, you mentioned the water department playing some part, and I think what you're referring to is the no poaching.
No poaching agreement, but that's such a tiny step. Look, the problem is every one of these cities has a mayor and city council. None of them want to give up their jobs. And so the only time we've had it is the former East Cleveland mayor, and you saw what happened to him. Yeah. He was recalled.
That's right. So next question is, you as a panel are pretty critical of Mayor Jackson's performance. What should we as a community, all of us, do in the future to find and get behind strong candidates for mayor?
You know, we've been criticizing the elements of his performance that merit criticism, but I would hate for it to be lost on people, the progress that the city did make these last 12 years in some of the most trying times. Even up onto the eve of the RNC, people were predicting Cleveland would fail miserably at hosting that, and it turned out to be a huge success. Frank Jackson's evolution as mayor, in his first 4 years, it was always about shoring up the finances. In his second term, he started to have big ideas like Public Square. In his third term, he weathered some very difficult challenges involving the police department, the RNC. And if he were to have left office at the end of the 12 years, I think his legacy would have been quite strong. That could change in the next 4 years. So I don't want people to leave thinking that this has just been criticism of Frank Jackson.
No, I mean, we're not just up here bashing him. I think there's a basic sense here. Well, I don't mean to speak for everybody, but he's a decent man. He's interested in public service. He's trustworthy and has got a good moral compass. And I think by and large voters have found him fairly likable over his first 3 terms in office. But the question now is, is Jackson fatigue perhaps setting in?
I think it was someone that said, and I can't remember who, that if you worship the sun, you'll never understand it. And I think to some extent we are trying to understand the sun. And we're taking a look at what he has done and to some degree what he has not done. And of course, if I were in charge or when I become king, things will be perfect. In the meantime, we're stuck with the politicians that we have.
But your question is, what can be done to find the new candidates?
Sure.
You're seeing quite a few, 40-some candidates in the council races, and you're seeing very young candidates. Mandolin is 32 years old. That next generation seems to be pushing. Blaine Griffin is running for council, or is a councilman. He was appointed, and he's running to retain the seat. He could be a future leader for the city. I mean, you're seeing people that offer some hope.
Mm-hmm. Although Frank Jackson did say that the key reason that he decided to run was that no one came forward that he thought was worth it, which even though those folks that you mentioned are, Blaine Griffin is, he didn't express interest in this, and we don't know.
Expressed interest.
Well, he didn't have the experience. I mean, he'd been one of the mayor's team members, but hadn't been in a independent office holding job himself. And so, I mean, I think it's pretty evident what he's doing. That's why he's running for council to set the table for an eventual mayor's run.
It's also respect. They were waiting to see if he would run before they would decide. But if he hadn't run, you'd have seen a Matt Zone or Kevin Kelly or Chris Ronayne or Blaine throwing their hat in the ring. Jackson's statement that he had to do it by default doesn't ring very true. There were plenty of people, I think, who would have put their hat in the ring.
Next question. A key problem with big cities is flight to suburbs. Why don't you guys live in Cleveland?
That's been a recurring theme ever since, I think, following World War II. And initially it was white flight and subsequently became black flight out of the city. And was it Fannie Lewis that started the construction boom prior to her death and built some very, very attractive houses. We had, I can't remember how many years ago, but we used to have a residency requirement for people that worked for the police department or the fire department, and that made all the sense in the world to me. But both firemen and policemen fought that, and so now firemen and policemen that are employed by the city can live anywhere they want to. Is that a good thing for the city? I don't think so, but that's the law as it stands right now. So I followed Tom Beres out to the suburbs. Otherwise, I'd be in Cleveland.
I guess just to be honest, I was kind of a body at rest tends to remain at rest here. I was born lived in Westlake, the pre-Crocker Park Westlake, when it was all fruit trees and cornfields, and just pretty much stayed out in that part of the community. I live in Rocky River now. But actually, my wife and I are sort of in a, when we get wild and crazy, what do we want to do moments here thinking about moving out of our house, thinking about maybe moving somewhere into a Cleveland neighborhood. Probably a long way from pulling the trigger on it, but the thoughts occurred to us. So.
I moved to town 21 years ago. I was living in Florida, visited Cleveland. A friend here took me on a tour at Cleveland Heights, and we just fell in love with it. So we moved there, and I've been there for 21 years. If we were coming up today, we very likely would have chosen Cleveland. It's just that's the neighborhood we visited.
I'll answer too. I live in Bay Village. I have two little kids who are 6 years old and 3. I chose, we were living in Lakewood before we moved to Bay Village, and we moved there for the schools, and also, to be perfectly honest, police response. When we lived in Lakewood, you could call the police and you knew they would be there within minutes, no matter what you were calling about. I think I called about a barking dog in the middle of the night, and they came to check it out. And I have heard so many stories in Cleveland about people calling the police for pretty serious things. And the cops would say, come and file your report when you have time. We're not going to send somebody. And, so that's the honest response, yeah. Let's see here. Who is the Cleveland politician today with the brightest future? Oh, that's a good one.
Used to be state senator. Nina Turner.
Nina Turner.
I would say Nina Turner. She's inspirational as far as I'm concerned.
I think she fits in that category, or at least people speculated
That's right.
that she might run for mayor had the mayor not run for mayor. I think she's pretty happy right now with her high-profile cable news commentating job, but she's still pretty active here with that progressive group, I think, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Our Revolution. The group's called Our Revolution.
Yes.
That would be my candidate.
I'm going to say Calvin Williams. It's just he is. There's nobody's seen a downside. He's been at all the places at the right times. His personal story is tremendous. He has reacted to everything exactly as you would hope. And if he in 4 years were to run, I think he'd have a very good chance of winning.
Well, not to throw a damper on that, and again, what they said yesterday isn't what they'll say tomorrow, but I remember before I left, I had a sidebar conversation with him where he basically just said, I have so many years for retirement, I'm just looking to get there and improve the department as much as I can along the way. I got no interest in politics.
I think he's telling a different story now.
Yeah.
So.
So the flip side of this question, which incumbent council people might lose in September or November?
I think the one who's probably facing the most difficult challenge is Terrell Pruitt, not because he's done a bad job. He's actually regarded as one of the best minds on council. He's running against Joe Jones, who was the councilman for that ward 10 years ago. He actually got convicted of a crime, but it's all been tossed. And Joe, I covered him when he was on council, and he was very strong on constituent service. He got the driveways plowed and the leaves raked for the seniors. Anytime he got a call, he dealt with it. Terrell Pruitt's in the military, and while he was away, there was a breakdown in constituent service, and I think Joe is campaigning pretty hard on that. We'll have to see whether he's as beloved now as he was then.
Any other thoughts from the panel?
Again, I'm kind of
Vulnerable.
out of the mix here, but I mean, the T.J. Dow has a lot of
Dow.
strong people running against him, or a lot of interesting people running
Right.
against him. Bashir Jones, Mansfield Fraser.
Mansfield Fraser.
Yeah.
I think TJ is vulnerable also.
Yeah. This is a good one for, oh, go ahead, you wanted
Well,
to.
the other one that's a wild card, and we've been writing about him, you've been writing about him, Leila, is Richard Starr is running against Phyllis Cleveland in Central. There's a good bit of dissatisfaction in Central with how the quality of life is. And so Richard's pretty beloved out there. He doesn't have a lot of experience, but you could see some turnover possibly there.
This is a great question, I think, for you guys. Who is the best mayor in the past 50 years and why?
I haven't been here for 50 years, so I really can't answer that.
Yeah, I don't. Political consciousness doesn't go quite that far back, but I guess maybe just of the people that I have covered in the 37 years that I worked at Channel 3, I would say the first two terms of Mike White. Mike White, the third term, maybe a little more problematic, but I think in terms of, being bold, decisive, and just seeing what he wanted to do, through completion and being take charge, and a feeling like he was running the city, a feeling like he was in charge.
I guess I would reluctantly agree with that. I see all the warts that other mayors have had over the years, and I've been around more than 50. So,
I wasn't here. I was in Carl Stokes, for instance. I wasn't here for Carl Stokes.
Yeah, I was.
Yeah.
Carl had a big fight with the police department, and they were hell bent on getting rid of Carl Stokes, or at least controlling him. Dennis Kucinich, the city did have all kinds of problems when he tried to save the public utility. Jane Campbell was in and out. She got a cup of coffee while she was mayor of the city.
What about George Voinovich?
I've got some serious concerns about George Voinovich, because when George Voinovich was mayor, the question was who was running the city. Was it King?
Well, like I say,
was it King George or Prince George?
If you partnered the George V with George F, maybe the combination would get the nod. But
I think by default, I would tend to agree. Mike White in his probably first couple of terms.
Yeah.
I don't have enough years to offer that.
Though I was surprised to see that neither, or maybe I'm wrong here. You had the 50 most prominent people in Cleveland history, and I was surprised to see neither Mike nor George were in that selection process.
Don't put too much credibility in those lists.
Okay, well.
So, just to be clear, Frank Jackson is not even a runner-up in this discussion.
I think it's hard to. It's immediate. You need the passage of time to tell how strong somebody is.
To see someone through rose-colored glasses.
Let's see all this stuff that's partway done
that's
turns
true.
out.
Right. So this is a very direct question. Who would you vote for if you lived here? On the spot.
That was a question that was put to me as I was walking in the door. And my answer was, I don't know. I would have to get a lot more information than I have right now. I can see the incumbents' problems. I can see the top two challengers. I can see their problems, and I have a lot of concerns about things that they've said. But I also think that it may be time for a change, but is there anybody waiting on deck that is prepared to take on the challenges of a major city? And I'm still planted firmly on the fence.
Well, I mean, what I think's already been told. We endorsed Frank Jackson Sunday. I think we fit in that same pattern of most of the people we're talking to it's time for a change, but none of the options are better
Are the
than
change
a
that's
fourth
required.
term.
Yeah.
Not at all crazy about a fourth term. You know, we know in Mike White's third term, things were not great, but the options are not better.
I mean, Frank is going to have a lot of. I mean, Mayor Jackson is going to have a lot of problems. I mean, a number of his top. Well, whether you agree, there's time to make some changes in his team members, but he's okay. So, Mr. Griffin, who was very effective in the community relations department, his chief of staff has moved on, and I think there are a number of his other. Cabinet level people who are not going to be around for a fourth term, and so you wonder if they'll just be replaced with chair warmers or whether he's going to try to really upgrade.
Well, you can't look to the future because anybody who comes knows it's just 4
Right,
years.
for one term.
One
Correct.
person he might tap into is Bill Patman. He's done fairly. He
knows a lot.
And he's been very good in this campaign. He wants to remain relevant, and he might be a good guy to bring into the administration.
Right. He knows a lot about city government, and you could hit the ground running.
Is there a candidate in the field that you think might be the most perilous choice, the most risky?
Probably, but there are slander and libel laws in place.
Yeah, what he said.
Oh, that's. Well, I think that's time. Thank you guys so much. Thank you so much for staying with us and for all the good questions.